Something is alive beneath Ireland's hills. People have whispered about it for over 2,000 years, but no one agrees on what they actually saw or heard. Some call them a lost people. Others say they were never human to begin with. But everyone agrees on one thing. You do not disturb what lies underground. This is the story of the Sidhe, Ireland's hidden kingdom. The story begins with three essential elements: the mounds themselves, the spirits people believed inhabited them, and the relationship between the living and what existed just beyond sight. Picture prehistoric Ireland, long before cities or churches. Communities built burial mounds to honor their dead. These monuments required months or years of communal labor, making them sacred by their very existence. The mounds became thresholds where the boundary between life and death grew thin. Standing beside one at twilight, you might hear whispers or feel an unexplained chill. The dead remained close. Over centuries, these beliefs transformed. The spirits evolved beyond ancestors into something distinct: the Sidhe. The word means people of the mounds in Old Irish. They were described as tall, luminous, and ageless. They moved through the world like light through water, visible one moment, vanished the next. Early Irish people saw nature as fully alive. Each hill had presence. Each stream had a guardian. The Sidhe embodied the land's consciousness itself. When crops flourished, the Sidhe were pleased. When storms destroyed harvests or cattle died, they were displeased. This worldview made sense of forces too vast to control: weather, fertility, death, time. The Druids and poets kept these traditions alive through precise descriptions. The Sidhe possessed hierarchies, territories, and laws. They had kings and queens who held councils. They mirrored human society, yet remained perfected, eternal, untouchable. Consider a farmer in ancient Ireland needing to clear a field. A mound stands in the middle, present since his grandfather's time. Digging it up means more than moving dirt. It means disturbing the Sidhe and inviting disaster. Crops might fail. Children might sicken. The balance between worlds depends on respect, on leaving certain spaces untouched. Belief became a form of power. The Sidhe shaped behavior and enforced boundaries without appearing. Fear of disturbing them kept ancient sites intact for millennia. Long after people forgot the mound's original purpose, the Sidhe emerged from lived experience of the environment. Ireland is a place of sudden mists, hidden valleys, and standing stones that appear without warning. The landscape feels alive. The Sidhe gave name to that feeling, the sense that the earth remembers everything. Morning fog clinging to hilltops. Certain fields feel inexplicably colder. Time seems to bend in ancient forests. These experiences created the legend. The Sidhe represented Ireland's acknowledgement that the land carries memory with consequences. When we discuss the Sidhe today, we examine how cultures live with forces beyond understanding or control. We see respect encoded into belief, invisible lines preventing societies from destroying the ground sustaining them. Those first whispers grew into voices that demanded acknowledgement, shaping everything that followed. The Sidhe began not as spirits, but as gods with names, powers, and kingdoms. Their transformation from divine rulers to hidden beings shaped everything that followed. These gods were called the Tuatha De Danann, meaning the people of the goddess Danu. Their story unfolds in three stages: the age of absolute power, the invasion that ended their reign, and the great retreat into transformation. In myth and legend, the Tuatha De Danann arrived from the north, shrouded in dark clouds. They mastered arts that seemed impossible, crafting swords that never missed their mark, brewing mead that granted wisdom, shaping weather itself. They brought 4 sacred treasures: a stone that screamed when the true king stood upon it, a spear guaranteeing victory, a sword that could not be drawn in unjust cause, and a cauldron never running empty. These objects symbolize complete mastery over life. The Tuatha Dé Danann established cities, laws, and festivals. Their kings bore names still remembered: Nuada of the silver hand, Lu of the long arm, the Dagda with his mighty club. Their rule seemed eternal. Then a new people arrived from the south, the Milesians, ancestors of modern humans. Mortal but determined, they wanted Ireland for themselves. War followed, reshaping reality itself. The Tuatha Dé Danann fought with magic and skill, yet numbers and fate turned against them. The Milesians won, though not through destruction. The Tuatha Dé Danann were immortal and could not truly be killed. Instead, they faced displacement. A deal was struck dividing Ireland into 2 realms. The Milesians took the surface world of fields, forests, and sky. The Tuatha Dé Danann received everything beneath: hollow hills, invisible roads, spaces between spaces. They ceased being gods who walked openly and became the Sidhe, hidden rulers of an underground kingdom existing alongside mortal Ireland without touching it. Imagine commanding armies and respect, only to be told you must live in shadows forever. Your power remains intact, but your presence vanishes. You exist, yet remain unseen. This transformation through loss turned the gods into something stranger and more dangerous. When power goes underground, it operates differently. The Tuatha Dé Danann retained their immortality, magic, and ancient knowledge. Operating from margins and liminal spaces, they became powers behind events rather than events themselves. A crop failure might indicate their displeasure. Sudden illness could mean offense given. A child born with unusual gifts might carry their blessing or curse. This myth mirrors universal human experience. Every culture endures change, conquest, replacement of old ways with new. The Tuatha Dé Danann story captures how old powers never truly depart. They retreat into memory, into landscape, into spaces we avoid thinking about. By going underground, the gods guaranteed their immortality more effectively than any battle could achieve. The Sidhe weren't born from nothing. They transformed from something greater, giving them weight, history, and legitimacy. Meeting a Sidhe in a story means encountering a being that once commanded armies, shaped kingdoms, and held power over life and death. That being now lives beneath your feet, remembering everything. The Great Division created 2 islands occupying the same space, one visible, one invisible. The border between them is the Earth's surface itself, marked by ancient mounds. Every hill became a doorway. Every threshold grew dangerous. Walking carelessly in Ireland meant potentially stepping from one world into another without realizing until too late. This moment when gods chose exile over extinction established the foundation for everything following. Every warning, every blessing, every tale of mortals wandering into forbidden places. The Tuatha Dé Danann descended underground, but remained present, still ruling, still watching. They simply became harder to perceive, and that underground kingdom they built would prove more extraordinary than anyone imagined. Once the Tuatha Dé Danann descended beneath the earth, they constructed a complete kingdom existing just beyond mortal senses. Understanding that realm reveals why the Sidhe became so powerful in Irish imagination. 3 core features define this world: the nature of time within it, the physical layout and beauty of the realm, and what happened to mortals who crossed over. The realm had a name: Tir na Nog, translating to the land of youth. This wasn't heaven in the Christian sense or an afterlife. It was a parallel island, occupying the same geographic space, but shifted slightly out of phase with ordinary reality. A perfect overlay where decay and age simply didn't apply. Time worked fundamentally differently there. In our world, seconds advance without mercy. You age, tire, and eventually die. In Tir na Nog, time stood still. Spending what felt like a single night dancing at a Sidhe feast meant emerging to discover 100 years had passed in the mortal realm. Your family would be dead, your house in ruins, your entire world transformed while you remained unchanged. This represented a fundamental difference in how existence operated once you crossed the threshold. Irish tales describe the realm with striking consistency. The Sidhe inhabited great halls made of gold and silver, lit by light that didn't come from sun or fire, but emanated from the walls themselves. These halls existed beneath the sea mounds, yet weren't cramped or dark. They were vast and impossibly spacious, defying normal geometry. A small hill from outside might contain a palace with 1,000 rooms inside. The Sidhe shaped these spaces from something beyond ordinary matter, from the substance of their own magic or the land's hidden potential. Glowing pathways stretched across Ireland, visible only to those with sight to perceive them. These roads linked every important sea, creating a network of communication and travel far more advanced than anything mortals possessed. The Sidhe could traverse Ireland from end to end in moments. Travelling beneath the feet of humans unaware, a highway ran below their farmland. Everything in Tir na Nog reached perfection. The music surpassed anything human composition could achieve. Food and drink satisfied completely, leaving no hunger or desire. The weather remained pleasant. Illness didn't exist. Conflict, when it occurred, was ritualized, resembling dance more than violence. It was paradise, yet paradise that felt subtly wrong, like a painting of life rather than life itself. Mortals occasionally stumbled into this realm, sometimes by accident, sometimes by invitation. A farmer might chase a rabbit into a sea mound and suddenly find himself in a golden hall. A musician might follow beautiful melodies underground. A warrior might accept a Sidhe lord's challenge, not knowing the duel would occur in another reality entirely. Consider such a mortal invited to a feast. You eat their food, drink their wine, dance to their music. It will be the finest night of your life. You feel no fatigue or worry, only pure joy. When dawn comes, or what seems like dawn, you thank your hosts and return home. Except home no longer exists. Your cottage is stones covered in vines. Your children are elderly or dead. Everyone you knew is gone. You've been in Tir na Nog for 50 or 100 years without aging a day. Then comes the cruelest aspect. Once you return to the mortal world, time catches up. The moment you dismount your horse or touch mortal soil with both feet, all those missing years crash down at once. Your body ages decades in seconds. You crumble to dust before horrified onlookers. This was the price of glimpsing perfection. You couldn't take it with you or survive in both worlds. This reveals essential Irish views on immortality. It wasn't a gift, but a different mode of existence, incompatible with mortal life. The Sidhe weren't fortunate or blessed. They were separate, cut off from the natural cycle of birth and death, giving mortal life its meaning. They had eternal youth, but lost something in exchange. The ability to change, to grow, to experience time as a river, rather than a frozen moment. The other world wasn't heaven, because you couldn't rest there. It wasn't hell, because beauty surpassed measure. It was simply another realm operating by rules so different from ours that crossing between them was inherently destructive. The Sidhe's realm demonstrates what the Irish feared as much as desired. Eternal youth sounds wonderful, yet eternal youth means eternal stagnation. The Sidhe couldn't grow old, but also couldn't truly change. They were fixed in their perfection like insects in amber, beautiful and lifeless simultaneously. The hidden realm was perfect the way a finished painting is perfect, complete, unchangeable, removed from life's vitality. The Sidhe built a world below mirroring the world above, yet removed everything making life worth living. Risk, change, death, and the fierce urgency those things bring to human experience. This underground kingdom would soon face challenges as mortals stopped accidentally wandering in and started deliberately testing its borders. As Ireland evolved from scattered settlements into organized kingdoms, humans began reshaping the land. They cleared forests, drained bogs, built fortresses, and established roads. This expansion brought inevitable conflict with Sidhe's sacred geography, initiating an age when violating old rules brought documented consequences. 3 types of encounters define this period: protective taboos around Sidhe sites, documented cases of rulers who ignored those taboos, and the codification of warnings into Irish law and custom. Ireland's landscape was covered in ancient structures predating memory: ring forts, standing stones, burial mounds. As Christianity spread and kingdoms centralized, these structures became obstacles. Farmers wanted them cleared for pasture. Lords wanted strategic hills for keeps. Old monuments stood in the way of progress. Yet people were afraid. The sea mounds weren't just ancient. They were occupied, spiritually speaking. Stories about the Sidhe, their power and vengeance, were known by everyone. Customs developed into unwritten laws. Never cut a lone hawthorn tree, especially near a mound. Never disturb ringfort stones after sunset. Never build a house directly in line with a sea entrance. Never dig into burial mounds seeking treasure. These weren't suggestions but survival rules, passed from parent to child with absolute weight. Breaking them meant paying. Cattle would sicken, crops would fail, children would fall ill. You might waste away from no disease physicians could name. The Sidhe protected their territory through misfortune, subtle and devastating. Medieval Irish chronicles, written by monks who were supposedly good Christians, document numerous incidents. They're not folklore collections. They're historical records treating these events as fact. The Book of Leinster, compiled in the 12th century, contains explicit warnings to kings and lords. Respect ancient forts and mounds or face divine punishment. One entry describes a king ordering a fairy fort demolished to build a church. Work proceeded for 3 days. On the 4th day, every labourer fell ill with fever. By week's end, the king was dead. The Chronicle states this as historical fact. The Annals of the Four Masters record similar incidents. A nobleman cuts down a sacred tree to expand his estate. His entire family dies within the year. A bishop orders a stone circle cleared for a monastery. The stones refuse to move despite numerous men pulling. When they finally topple one stone, the bell tower of the new church collapses that same night, killing 2 monks. These stories reveal significant patterns. They weren't peasant superstitions. Educated elites, people representing rationality and Christian faith, recorded these warnings. They believed the Sidhe could and would punish violations of sacred space. More than believed, they documented it. The warnings became codified into actual law. The Brehon Laws, Ireland's ancient legal code, contained provisions about respecting fairy forts and sacred trees. Destroying such sites could result in fines or loss of status. Even after English common law replaced the Brehon system, local customs maintained these prohibitions. Landlords might have legal right to clear land, yet they'd still avoid certain hills, groves, and inexplicable boundaries everyone knew not to cross. These taboos worked. Ireland today still has over 45,000 ring forts and ancient structures scattered across the countryside. In most of Europe, similar structures were destroyed centuries ago, cleared for agriculture or building stone. In Ireland, they survived not because of government protection, which came much later, but because people feared touching them. The Sidhe became guardians of sacred geography without appearing. Their reputation alone sufficed. This is belief as conservation, fear as preservation. The old gods, now hidden beneath the earth, protected their territory more effectively in absence than they could have in presence. Consider the ripple effect. When you inherit a field with a ring fort in it, you work around it. That means less farmland, but avoids angering forces beyond understanding. Your neighbor sees you respecting the site and does the same. Your children learn the boundary is sacred. 3 generations later, no one remembers exactly why, but everyone knows you don't touch the fairy fort. You don't mention it loudly after dark. This creates a landscape of memory where physical features encode cultural knowledge. Every protected hill, every lone tree standing in a field, every pile of stones no one will move, they're all information storage, reminders of a time when boundaries between worlds mattered more than convenience. The age of warnings demonstrates how belief systems maintain themselves. The Sidhe didn't need to constantly prove their power. Consequences needed only to be frequent enough, random enough, and terrible enough that people self-policed. One genuine tragedy became 100 stories, which became 1,000 warnings, which became universal custom. Respecting the Sidhe centered on survival rather than reverence. You left old places alone because you'd seen what happened, heard about what happened, or knew someone who'd tested the boundaries and paid for it. The warnings worked because they made sense of misfortune. When bad things happen, and bad things always happen, people need explanations. The Sidhe provided one. Your child died of sudden illness. You must have offended them somehow. Your harvest failed. Perhaps you built too close to a sacred site. The explanation blamed breaking invisible rules, meaning you could protect yourself by following those rules more carefully. The age of warnings transformed the Sidhe from active agents into passive threats. They didn't need to appear or intervene directly. Their reputation accomplished all the work. A threat you never see is harder to rationalize away than one standing before you. The old gods went underground and became guardians of memory itself, protectors of landscape and custom, enforcers of boundaries existing as much in human minds as in physical space. Soon, a new religion would attempt to explain these beings and find them surprisingly resistant to elimination. When Christianity arrived in Ireland during the 5th century, it encountered an established belief system. The people believed absolutely in the Sidhe, in the reality of the other world, in the power of ancient gods beneath the hills. Simply declaring these things didn't exist wouldn't work. Too many people had experiences, traditions, and warnings passed through generations. The church developed a different strategy. Keep the Sidhe, but change what they meant. 3 transformations accomplished this: redefining the Sidhe within Christian theology, reshaping old festivals without eliminating them, and having even saints contend with these beings. Christianity operates with God, angels, demons, and human souls. The Sidhe fit nowhere in that hierarchy. They weren't devils because they didn't actively serve Satan. They weren't angels because they were tied to earth, not heaven. They weren't human souls because they never lived and died as mortals. They were something else entirely, and Christianity needed a classification. The solution was pragmatic. The Sidhe became fallen angels, but not the kind cast all the way to hell. When Lucifer rebelled and God cast him out, some angels remained neutral according to the new story. They didn't fight for God, but didn't fight against him either. These lukewarm angels were punished with exile from heaven, yet spared hell's torments. They were cast down to earth, taking refuge beneath hills, forever stuck between salvation and damnation. This explanation allowed people to maintain belief in the Sidhe, while technically making them part of Christian cosmology. The old gods became neutral spirits, neither wholly good nor wholly evil, dangerous but not demonic. You still had to respect them and couldn't disturb their places. Now that respect was framed as caution toward corrupted spiritual beings, rather than reverence for pagan deities. The Church redirected belief rather than destroying it. People still left offerings for the Sidhe, still avoided sacred sites, still whispered prayers of protection. They also prayed to saints, attended Mass, and considered themselves Christian. The two systems coexisted, overlapping without quite contradicting each other. Consider how this worked with festivals. Samhain, the ancient Celtic New Year celebrated at October's end, was when the boundary between worlds grew thinnest. The Sidhe were especially active then, moving freely between realms. People lit bonfires, left offerings, and performed rituals protecting themselves from unwanted otherworldly attention. Christianity couldn't erase Samhain. It was too ingrained in agricultural and social calendars. Instead, it absorbed the festival. Samhain became All Hallows' Eve, the night before All Saints' Day. Bonfires continued, but priests now blessed them. Offerings continued, but were framed as remembrance of the dead rather than appeasement of the Sidhe. Same actions, different explanations. The same thing happened with other sacred times. Beltane, the spring festival when the Sidhe supposedly blessed crops, was absorbed into May Day celebrations with Christian overtones. Old customs survived by accepting a thin veneer of new meaning. When new religions arrive, they rarely erase what came before. Instead, they build on top of it, incorporating what they can't eliminate. The Sidhe were too present in lived experience to vanish because a new God was preached. They persisted, redefined but recognizable. Irish hagiographies, the lives of saints written by monks, contain numerous encounters with the Sidhe. St. Patrick supposedly banished Sidhe from various hills to establish churches. Yet notice the language. He didn't prove they didn't exist. He drove them out the way you drive out squatters, acknowledging their reality, while asserting Christian power over them. St. Columba reportedly met Sidhe lords while travelling, and had to negotiate safe passage. St. Brigid blessed wells already sacred to pre-Christian spirits, not replacing them, but claiming authority over them. These weren't presented as myths or legends, but recorded as factual accounts of spiritual warfare, Christian saints asserting dominance over older powers. This created an unusual dynamic. People now had two sources of supernatural power, the saints and the Sidhe. If your cow went missing, you might pray to St. Brigid, but also leave milk out for the good folk. The Church officially frowned on this double insurance, though in practice, priests often participated. Better to be cautious. Consider the long-term effect of this theological compromise. By making the Sidhe fallen angels, the Church gave them eternal life in a new form. As cultural Christianity weakened over centuries, people stopped fearing hell and devil. Yet they kept fearing the Sidhe because the Sidhe were present in the landscape, in boundaries you couldn't cross, in consequences that came from disrespect. The Church attempted to bury the old gods, but ended up preserving them. Monks wrote down the stories, recording them in annals and chronicles. Warnings were codified in Christian terms, given biblical weight. Festivals continued under new names. The Sidhe, beings that shouldn't exist in a Christian universe, were given an origin story keeping them alive in imagination and practice. The Sidhe survived Christianity not by fighting it, but by being too useful to discard. They explained local customs the church didn't want to eliminate. They provided continuity between pre-Christian and Christian Ireland. They gave people something concrete to fear and respect in the landscape itself. A far-off God in heaven was abstract. The Sidhe in the hill behind your house were immediate. People prayed to saints, but still left milk at doorsteps for the good folk. They attended Mass on Sunday, but refused to cut fairy trees on Monday. They baptized their children, but also tied red thread around cribs to ward off changelings. The old and new coexisted because neither could fully replace the other. The church arrived and transformed everything, yet the Sidhe remained. Not unchanged, certainly, but present, still powerful, still demanding respect. The gods went underground, acquired new names and explanations, and continued ruling the spaces Christianity couldn't quite claim. This theological compromise would have darker consequences as belief in the Sidhe evolved into something more dangerous. By the 1600s through the 1800s, belief in the Sidhe had evolved into something darker. The old gods beneath the hills were no longer just guardians of sacred places. They became kidnappers, thieves who stole what humans held most precious: children, health, and loved ones. This was the age of changeling tales, and it ended in tragedy. 3 elements define this period: what changelings were and how they supposedly worked, the social conditions enabling these beliefs to take hold powerfully, and the real consequences when belief crossed into violence. The Sidhe, for reasons never quite explained, desired mortal children. Perhaps they needed fresh blood to strengthen their declining race. Perhaps they coveted what they couldn't have: the ability to grow, change, and experience time as mortals did. For whatever reason, they would steal into homes at night and take babies from cradles. They didn't leave cradles empty. That would be too obvious. Instead, they left a replacement, a changeling. This might be an elderly Sidhe disguised as the child, a piece of enchanted wood, or even one of their own sickly offspring. The changeling would look like the real child, at least initially, but something would be wrong. It would cry constantly. It wouldn't grow properly. It might seem strangely knowing, old wisdom looking out from infant eyes. It would never laugh, play, or thrive the way a real child should. The real child, meanwhile, was taken into the other world to live forever young, serving the Sidhe in their hidden halls. Parents were left with an imposter, and unless they recognized the switch quickly and took action, their real child was lost forever. If you believed your child was a changeling, you had to make it so uncomfortable that the Sidhe would take it back and return your real child. The methods were severe. You'd place the suspected changeling near fire, not close enough to burn, but close enough to terrify. You'd threaten it with violence. You'd leave it outside overnight on a fairy mound, hoping the Sidhe would pity it and make the exchange. Consider what was actually happening. A family has a child who's sick, disabled, or neurodivergent. Perhaps the child has conditions that weren't understood at the time. The parents, desperate to understand why their child isn't developing normally, seize on the changeling explanation. It's not that something's wrong with their child. This isn't their child at all. Their real child is fine, just trapped elsewhere. This belief was widespread, not just rural superstition, but common cultural knowledge. Folklorists in the 1800s collected hundreds of changeling stories from across Ireland, Britain, and parts of continental Europe. The details varied, but the core belief remained consistent. The Sidhe stole children and left substitutes. The stories extended beyond children. Young brides were supposedly stolen on wedding nights. Talented musicians would be taken to play at Sidhe feasts. Beautiful young women would vanish, only to return years later, dazed, and claiming they'd been held in an underground kingdom. Any unexplained disappearance, any sudden change in personality or health, could be attributed to Sidhe interference. In 1895, in Ballyvadlia, Ireland, a woman named Bridget Cleary became the centre of an infamous case. Bridget fell ill with what was probably pneumonia or bronchitis. Instead of recovering, she grew worse. Her behaviour became erratic. She said strange things. Her husband, Michael, became convinced she wasn't Bridget at all, but a changeling Sidhe had left in her place. Michael and several relatives subjected Bridget to treatments meant to force Sidhe to return to his real wife. They held her over fire. They forced her to drink mysterious concoctions. They demanded she declare 3 times that she was Bridget Cleary, wife of Michael Cleary, believing this admission would break the enchantment. Bridget died. Her body was found burned in a shallow grave. Michael Cleary was arrested and tried for manslaughter. His defence was direct. He didn't kill his wife. He killed a changeling. His real wife was still with Sidhe, and he expected her to return riding a white horse any day. The court rejected that defence. Michael was convicted and imprisoned. The case shocked Ireland and the wider world. This wasn't ancient history. This was the end of the 19th century, the age of trains and telegraphs, and people still believed in the Sidhe intensely enough to kill for it. The Bridget Cleary case reveals important truths. Belief in Sidhe wasn't fading folklore. It was active, powerful, and dangerous. It provided explanations for things people couldn't otherwise understand. Illness, disability, mental health crises, sudden death. In a world without modern medicine or psychology, the Sidhe filled gaps, gave names to nameless terrors. The changeling tales often masked genuine tragedy. A woman suffering from postpartum depression might be seen as stolen by Sidhe. A child born with disabilities might be labelled a changeling rather than receiving care. An elderly person developing dementia might be suspected of being a Sidhe replacement. The belief gave structure to tragedy, but also provided justification for neglect or worse. These weren't ancient stories. They were modern Ireland's last battles with its invisible past. Into the 20th century, people still whispered about changelings. They still performed rituals protecting newborns. They still left offerings for the Sidhe. Old beliefs didn't die with education and electricity. They adapted, persisted, and found new forms. The Dark Age of fairy abductions demonstrates belief at its most powerful and most dangerous. The Sidhe, once gods and then guardians, had become figures of absolute fear, blamed for every unexplained misfortune. They'd evolved from beings to respect into beings to fear completely. Yet even in this darkest chapter, the core remained. The Sidhe were real to believers, real enough to shape behaviour, real enough to justify terrible acts, real enough to kill for. These beliefs would soon manifest in even more tangible ways, literally shaping Ireland's physical landscape through roads that exist only because people refuse to block them. Ireland possesses an invisible infrastructure, a network of paths the Sidhe supposedly used to travel between their domains. These fairy roads connect ancient mounds, mark territorial boundaries, and cut across fields and forests in straight lines only visible to those who know how to look. Modern Ireland still respects them. 3 layers define this phenomenon. what fairy roads are and how people identify them, the physical markers and rules surrounding them, and modern examples of these beliefs affecting real-world development. Stand at one ancient ring fort and look toward another. Often they align perfectly, as if connected by an invisible thread. Generations of people notice these alignments, observing strange occurrences along those lines. Unexplained cold spots, animals refusing to cross certain spaces, people reporting eerie feelings or visions when walking particular paths at certain times. These observations crystallized into knowledge. The Sidhe travel between dwelling places along specific routes. These routes are their roads, their highways through mortal lands. Like any road, they need to remain clear. Block a fairy road and you're not just building on empty land, you're obstructing traffic, creating a roadblock in someone else's territory. The Sidhe express their displeasure. Displeasure manifests as the usual catalogue of misfortune. Bad luck, illness, financial ruin, accidents. Sometimes effects are more dramatic. Walls built across fairy roads crumble overnight. Houses placed on them experience constant problems. Doors that won't stay shut. Persistent cold. Strange noises. Inhabitants who never feel comfortable. Cattle won't walk certain paths. Dogs bark at empty air along particular lines. The most common indicator is the lone hawthorn tree, sometimes called a fairy thorn. These trees grow naturally, but when one appears in isolation, especially near an ancient site, it marks something significant. A boundary, a road, definitely a place to avoid disturbing. Hawthorn trees have special status in Irish tradition. They bloom white in May, beautiful and fragrant. Yet cutting one is profoundly unlucky, especially if it stands alone. The wood is said to bleed when cut, showing Sidhe's displeasure. Stories abound of people who cut hawthorns and paid terrible prices. Deaths in the family, livestock dying, homes destroyed by fire. These aren't old superstitions everyone ignores. Irish farmers today work around lone hawthorns. They'll plough up to them, but not through them. They'll build fences that detour around them. The trees stand like ancient sentinels in otherwise completely developed land, and nobody touches them. In 2011, a major highway project in County Clare encountered an obstacle. The bush, a lone hawthorn tree marking a fairy road. Locals protested, warning that disturbing the tree would bring disaster. The developers, educated modern engineers, dismissed these concerns as superstition. Problems started immediately. Equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. Workers fell ill. Delays piled up, costing enormous amounts of money. Eventually, someone made the call: reroute the highway around the tree. The moment that decision was made, problems stopped. The project completed without further issue. The bush still stands today, with a motorway curving around it, a compromise between progress and respect. This isn't an isolated case. Ireland's roads contain similar detours everywhere. Bits of highway that jog unexpectedly around nothing visible. Fields with odd channels cut through them. Construction projects that suddenly shift course for no apparent reason. Ask locals and they'll explain. Fairy road. Can't block it. These aren't religious beliefs enforced by organized faith. The church never officially endorsed fairy roads. They're folk beliefs, maintained entirely by culture and consequence. Yet they're powerful enough to affect millions of euros in infrastructure spending, to reroute highways, to preserve trees and stones without official protection. Ireland's landscape contains thousands more prehistoric monuments than comparable European countries. Partly, that's because the sites themselves were protected by Sidhe associations. The fairy roads accomplish something additional. They preserve relationships between sites, the invisible geography connecting one sacred place to another. Archaeologists have noticed the fairy roads often align with legitimate ancient trackways or sightlines used in prehistoric astronomy. The folk belief preserved actual historical information, encoded in stories about dangerous paths the Sidhe use. Invisible roads map onto real ancient infrastructure, maintained through supernatural belief where archaeological knowledge was lost. You inherit land with a fairy road crossing it. You could ignore the belief and build whatever you want, or you could respect it, leaving that strip uncultivated or unbuilt. Most people choose respect. Even if you're skeptical, the risk-reward calculation doesn't favor challenging it. If you're right and it's superstition, you gain a bit of extra usable land. If you're wrong, or if the belief protects something that should be protected for other reasons, you invite disaster. The cost of respect is minimal. The potential cost of disrespect is catastrophic. The fairy roads demonstrate belief as practical cartography. The Sidhe's invisible kingdom isn't just underground. It extends across the surface in a network of protected paths and spaces. These paths shape development patterns, preserve archaeological features, and maintain green corridors through otherwise fully developed landscapes. The Sidhe's world continues shaping the real one not through power or violence, but through persistent belief, making disturbing certain spaces too risky to contemplate. The old gods beneath the hills maintain their authority by never directly exercising it, by letting reputation and consequence accomplish all work. Every hawthorn tree standing alone in a field is a marker, a warning, a promise. The Sidhe still travels here. This space is theirs. Respect the boundary and prosper. Ignore it at your peril. Modern Ireland, with all its technology and education, still navigates around invisible roads on a map, drawn by beliefs thousands of years old. The underground kingdom extends further than imagined, reaching into the present day, into engineering decisions and construction budgets, into fundamental questions of who owns the land. These ancient beings would soon be reclaimed and transformed into something new. Symbols of national identity during Ireland's darkest hours. By the late 1800s, Ireland was under British rule with its language suppressed and culture dismissed as primitive superstition. Writers and artists emerged who saw value in old beliefs. They looked at the Sidhe and recognized the essence of Irish identity itself. The Celtic revival transformed Sidhe once more. 3 movements define this transformation. How writers like Yeats reframed fairy beliefs as cultural treasures. How the Sidhe became symbols of resistance and national identity. And what this literary movement revealed about the persistence of these beings in Irish imagination. A poet named William Butler Yeats walked the roads of County Sligo, collecting fairy stories from local people. Yeats was educated, worldly, and exposed to modern rationalism. Yet when he listened to Irish peasants talk about the Sidhe, he heard something profound. Not ignorance or superstition, but a different way of understanding reality. One rooted in Ireland's landscape and history. Yeats began publishing these stories, first in folklore collections, then in his own poetry. He didn't treat them as quaint relics. He presented them as evidence of Irish spiritual depth, proof that Ireland possessed something Britain's industrial materialism could never touch, an enchanted world view, a living relationship with the numinous. In Yeats's work, the Sidhe became fallen angels not wholly evil. They were beautiful, terrible, and thoroughly Irish. They represented everything making Ireland different from England. Mystery over mechanism, beauty over utility, spiritual depth over material progress. They embodied the soul of Ireland given form. British colonialism justified itself through claims of civilizing primitive peoples. The Irish were superstitious, backward, childlike in their beliefs. They needed British guidance to modernize. Yeats and his contemporaries reversed this narrative. The Irish believe in fairies, and that's not a weakness, but a strength. It means Ireland hasn't lost what modern civilization destroys: connection to nature, to mystery, to otherworldly dimensions of existence. Lady Augusta Gregory, another key figure in the Celtic revival, collected fairy tales directly from Irish speakers in Western Ireland, places where English authority barely reached. Her books presented these beliefs without condescension, treating informants as bearers of valuable cultural knowledge rather than amusing superstitions. This movement took beliefs educated classes were abandoning, that Christianity had tried to suppress, that modernization was eroding, and declared them valuable, essential even. The Sidhe weren't embarrassing remnants of a primitive past. They were Ireland's unique cultural treasure, evidence of spiritual sophistication that Britain, for all its power, couldn't match. The Sidhe appeared throughout Celtic revival art, in poems where they represented unattainable beauty, in plays where they embodied Ireland's tragic history, in paintings where they emerged from mist and twilight, forever slipping between worlds. They became symbols of Ireland itself, ancient, wronged, unconquerable, still present despite attempts to erase them. During this period, Ireland was fighting for independence, for the right to self-govern, for recognition of Irish identity as legitimate and valuable. The Celtic revival provided cultural ammunition for that fight. Irish myths, stories, and unique relationships with the spiritual world demonstrated a civilization that wasn't primitive but different, and that difference deserved respect and autonomy. The Sidhe became nationalist symbols without being explicitly political. You couldn't suppress them the way you could suppress political organizing. They were cultural, artistic, seemingly harmless fairy tales. Yet they carried powerful messages. Ireland has depths Britain can't touch. History Britain can't erase. Identity Britain can't assimilate. The Celtic revival writers weren't trying to restore belief in the Sidhe as literal truth. Yeats himself probably didn't think fairy mounds contained actual underground kingdoms, yet he believed in their importance, in what they represented about Irish consciousness and connection to place. The Sidhe were true in a deeper sense than literal fact, true to Irish experience, true to the landscape, true to a way of being in the world. This created a new form for the Sidhe to inhabit. They'd been gods, then spirits, then dangerous kidnappers, and now they became metaphors, powerful metaphors that shaped how Irish people understood themselves and their nation. The Sidhe were Ireland's beauty, Ireland's tragedy, Ireland's unconquerable spirit surviving conquest and oppression. For centuries, educated people mocked fairy beliefs. Now suddenly, educated people were celebrating them, collecting them, enshrining them in poetry and art. The grandmother who left milk out for the good folk was no longer embarrassing. She was preserving authentic Irish culture against English colonialism. Her beliefs had political value. The Celtic revival also preserved these stories in writing, creating permanent records just as oral tradition was weakening. Young people were leaving rural areas for cities. English was replacing Irish as the primary language. Old storytelling traditions were dying, yet thanks to Yeats, Gregory, and others, the stories survived on the page, accessible to future generations who'd never sit by a fire listening to traditional storytellers. The Sidhe shifted form again, from legend to literature. They were no longer beings you might encounter, but symbols you could invoke. They represented continuity with the past, resistance to cultural erasure, the persistence of Irish identity through centuries of oppression. They proved Ireland had depth, history, and spiritual resources that colonial power couldn't touch. When Ireland eventually won independence, the Sidhe were part of that victory. Not through direct action, but through what they represented. Ireland's unique cultural heritage, its difference from Britain, its right to exist on its own terms. The old gods beneath the hills had become shields in a cultural war. The Sidhe survived the Celtic revival, transformed once more. No longer quite real in the old sense, but real in a new way, as enduring symbols of Irish identity, as proof of cultural continuity, as reminder that some things can't be conquered because they exist deeper than politics, older than empires, rooted in the very soil of the land. Beneath those literary myths, however, lay real history waiting to be discovered. For centuries, people avoided disturbing sea mounds and ring forts out of fear. They believed the Sidhe lived there, that digging would bring curse and calamity. Modern archaeology arrived, equipped with scientific methods. What they found beneath those protected sites was extraordinary. A density of prehistoric structures unmatched anywhere in Europe, preserved by belief where evidence everywhere else had been destroyed. 3 discoveries define this exploration: what the fairy forts actually were, the preservation these sites achieved through supernatural protection, and what this reveals about the relationship between myth and history. When archaeologists systematically surveyed Ireland, they discovered over 45,000 ring forts, circular earthwork enclosures, built during the Iron Age and early medieval period. That's an astonishing number for a small island. Ireland has roughly 1 ring fort for every square mile of land. These structures were domestic settlements, fortified farmsteads, where families lived and worked. They consisted of circular earthen banks with wooden palisades, enclosing houses, storage buildings, and animal pens. They weren't military forts in most cases, just defensible homesteads, protection against raiders and wild animals. Over time, the forts were abandoned as settlement patterns changed. Wood rotted away. Buildings collapsed. Eventually, all that remained were circular banks and ditches, mysterious rings in the landscape with no obvious purpose. People forgot what they were, yet remembered. They were important, sacred, and dangerous. They became fairy forts, dwelling places of the Sidhe. Ireland also contains thousands of Neolithic passage tombs and burial cairns, some dating back 5,000 years. These are older than the ring forts by millennia. Newgrange, the most famous, was already ancient when Egyptians built the pyramids. These mounds became associated with the Sidhe. They were clearly built by someone for some purpose in a time beyond memory. They contained chambers and passages, dark spaces leading underground. They aligned with astronomical events, showing sophisticated knowledge. What could they be except gateways to the other world? This association accomplished something remarkable. For thousands of years, people left these monuments alone. They didn't quarry them for building stone. They didn't dig into them looking for treasure. They didn't plough them under to create more farmland. The belief that they belonged to the Sidhe protected them more effectively than any law could have. In most of Europe, similar structures were destroyed, quarried for churches, castles, and roads, demolished to clear fields, lost to development and agricultural expansion. Britain, France, Germany all lost the majority of their prehistoric monuments. Ireland preserved them not through conscious historical preservation, which didn't exist until recently, but through fear. Archaeologists excavating these sites found beautiful artifacts: gold torques, bronze weapons, intricate jewelry, evidence of sophisticated societies with long-distance trade connections. Burial chambers containing human remains are thousands of years old. Art carved into stone, spirals, geometric patterns, symbols whose meaning remains elusive. Each site told stories about real people who lived, worked, died, and were mourned. These weren't magical beings, but humans like us, building communities, raising children, creating beauty, facing death. They'd been remembered, distorted through time, until history became legend, became myth. The fairy beliefs preserved not just monuments, but knowledge that they were important. People didn't know why the ring forts mattered, yet they knew they did matter. The supernatural explanation kept truth alive in symbolic form, until archaeology could recover literal facts. Consider the ring forts again. 45,000 sites represent the largest collection of early medieval archaeological sites in Europe. Because of fairy beliefs, Ireland has an unparalleled record of how ordinary people lived 1,000 years ago. Not kings and nobles, whose monuments might be preserved anyway, but farmers and herders, the 99% of history who usually leave no trace. The Sidhe became unintentional custodians of Ireland's past. By making sites too dangerous to disturb, they ensured future generations could study them. Myth preserved history better than any conscious effort could have managed. Because so many sites survived, archaeologists can study patterns, settlement distribution, agricultural practices, trade networks, social organization. They can track how communities changed over centuries, how technology spread, how climate affected where people lived. Ireland's fairy beliefs created an archaeological laboratory unique in the world. Yet there's tension. The very belief protecting these sites made them hard to study initially. Local communities often opposed excavations, even scientific ones with proper permits. They still feared disturbing the Sidhe, bringing misfortune on their families and farms. Archaeologists had to negotiate with both legal authorities and local sensibilities. This tension continues today. Ireland legally protects archaeological sites, though many remain privately owned. Farmers and landowners balance legal obligations, scientific interest, and cultural beliefs. Some still won't allow excavation, not because of legal concerns, but because of fears they can't quite shake. The buried truth beneath legends shows how myth and history intertwine. The Sidhe weren't real as the stories described them. There are no immortal beings in golden halls beneath hills. Yet the Sidhe were real as a cultural mechanism, a way of encoding importance and enforcing protection across generations. The stories preserved what they claimed to describe, not the Sidhe themselves, but the places associated with them. Myths saved monuments. Fear protected facts. Now archaeologists can read the real history that survived because people believed in impossible things. Ireland's underground kingdom was real after all, just not in expected ways. It was real history, real people, real lives preserved by unreal beliefs. The Sidhe, those beings that never existed, managed to save evidence of those who did exist, protecting the past for the future by inhabiting the space between. Myth saved Ireland's archaeology long before modern heritage laws existed. The old gods, transformed into fairies, became better protectors of historical truth than any institution could manage. These ancient beliefs continue to resonate in modern Ireland, revealing something essential about belief, land, and memory. The Sidhe aren't gone. They're woven into Ireland's landscape, into how people treat their land, into decisions made by engineers, farmers, and ordinary citizens every day. Understanding their persistence reveals something profound about how belief works, why it matters, and what we lose when we dismiss it. 3 questions frame this final exploration. How the Sidhe function in modern Ireland, what they represent beyond their literal story, and why their survival matters to everyone, wherever we live. Ireland, a modern European nation with smartphones and highways and technology, still respects fairy roads, still works around lone hawthorn trees, still calls ancient earthworks fairy forts and treats them accordingly. Walk through rural Ireland and you'll see this: fields with inexplicable gaps where nothing is planted, roads curving around empty spots, trees standing alone that should have been cleared decades ago for efficiency. Ask why, and you'll get variations on the same answer. It's a fairy place. We don't disturb it. Bad things happen when you do. These aren't elderly people clinging to old ways. Young farmers maintain these practices. Developers in their 30s and 40s reroute projects around protected sites. Not everyone literally believes in the Sidhe as glowing immortal beings. Yet everyone respects the possibility, the risk, the wisdom encoded in the taboo. At their core, the Sidhe represent a cultural technology for preserving sacred geography. They mark boundaries between cultivated and wild, between past and present, between what humans control and what they shouldn't touch. These boundaries matter. Consider landscapes where no such beliefs existed or where modernization successfully eradicated them. Every square meter gets exploited for maximum utility. Ancient forests become lumber. Wetlands become developments. Historical sites become parking lots. Nothing stops the complete transformation of land into a commodity. The Sidhe creates friction in that process. Not much, just enough. A developer thinks twice before clearing a particular spot. A farmer leaves a margin of wild land rather than cultivating every inch. A road engineer accepts a slightly less efficient route. These small hesitations add up to preserved biodiversity, protected archaeological sites, green spaces threading through developed areas. The Sidhe function whether or not anyone believes they're literally real. The mechanism works through uncertainty and respect for tradition. You don't have to think glowing immortals actually live beneath hills. You just need to think maybe there's something to the old warnings. Maybe ancestors knew things worth respecting. Maybe some spaces should remain untouched regardless of economic incentive. This is belief as practical wisdom rather than propositional truth. The Sidhe might not be real, yet the consequences of respecting them are real. Preserved history, maintained biodiversity, cultural continuity, spaces set aside from pure utility. The belief works whether the beings exist or not. Every culture has versions of this: sacred groves, forbidden grounds, places marked as special and separate. These aren't universal across cultures, but the mechanism is universal. Belief protects what deserves protection when law and economics can't or won't. As modernization spreads globally, we're losing these protected spaces faster than we can create new legal protections. By the time scientific consensus declares a forest ecologically crucial or an archaeological site historically significant, it's often already destroyed. Spaces protected by belief survive until formal protection can catch up. Ireland's 45,000 preserved ring forts are now tourist attractions, research sites, and cultural heritage, bringing millions of euros in economic value. The fairy beliefs protecting them weren't economically rational in the short term. You lose productive land. In the long term, they preserved assets that conscious planning couldn't have maintained. The Sidhe demonstrate that some valuable things get protected through mechanisms that appear irrational but function well. Not everything important can be justified through economic cost-benefit analysis. Some spaces need to be sacred, set apart, respected regardless of immediate utility. When we dismiss these beliefs entirely, we lose something essential: Some people took fairy beliefs too far, caused harm through changeling accusations and superstitious cruelty. We can and should reject those excesses, yet the core mechanism, respect for sacred geography enforced through spiritual belief, served important functions we're now struggling to replace. Modern environmental protection tries to accomplish through law and science what the Sidhe accomplished through story and fear. It's harder than expected. Laws can be changed when politically inconvenient. Scientific designations require evidence that may not exist until damage is done. Belief, deeply rooted cultural belief, is remarkably persistent and hard to overturn for profit. The Sidhe ultimately represent the unseen balance between respect and ruin. They remind us that nature and spirit, land and meaning, were once inseparable. Maybe they still are, or should be. They challenge the assumption that everything should be available for exploitation, that value equals measurable utility, that progress means total transformation of landscape to human will. In a modern world built on speed and the commodification of every space, the Sidhe stands for what remains when we slow down. The lone tree in the field. The mound was left untouched. The road curving around nothing visible. These are small resistances to total domination, tiny rebellions against the idea that everything must serve immediate human purposes. The kingdom of the Sidhe exists not beneath the hills, but in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. It exists in every decision to leave something alone, to respect boundaries that make no economic sense, to preserve mystery and margin in an increasingly explained and exploited world. Their story is Ireland's story, one that went underground but never disappeared, one that adapted through conquest, suppression, and modernity, one that transformed repeatedly yet retained its essence, its core function, its stubborn persistence against all attempts to erase it. The Sidhe matter because they prove belief can protect what's worth protecting when nothing else will. They show that respect for the numinous serves practical purposes, that some wisdom gets encoded in stories because it's too important to trust logic alone. Ireland's underground kingdom stands as a reminder of what we're losing and what we might still save, not through bringing back literal belief in fairies, but through understanding what those beliefs accomplished and finding new ways to achieve the same ends. Protected spaces, respected boundaries, the humility to leave some things untouched and some questions unanswered. The Sidhe endure because we need them or something like them. We need friction against total exploitation. We need sacred geography that law can't fully replace. We need stories protecting what we can't quite justify protecting through pure rationality. The gods went underground thousands of years ago. They never left. They're still there, in the boundaries we maintain, without quite knowing why, in the respect we show to places and things that transcend utility, in the quiet voice that says, "Leave it alone. It's not yours to take. Some things belong to themselves." That voice speaks in accents different from ancient Irish now. Yet it's the same voice, carrying the same message, protecting the same truth. The land has memory, and that memory matters more than convenience, profit, or progress. The Sidhe's final gift isn't magic or immortality. It's a reminder that not everything should bend to human will, that mystery and margin aren't luxuries but necessities, that the spaces we leave untouched define us as much as the ones we transform. The last kingdom stands invisible but influential, underground but everywhere, impossible yet undeniably real in its effects. As long as Ireland curves its roads around empty trees and protects its ancient mounds, as long as people respect boundaries they can't quite explain, the Sidhe remain what they've always been, guardians of the threshold between what we know and what we've forgotten, witnesses to the truth that some things survive best when protected by impossible stories. The kingdom beneath the hills is Ireland's gift to itself and to the rest of us. Proof that belief, wielded carefully, can be the strongest protection for what matters most.